I'll just figure if we find anything important in here. But yeah, so we have that little thing where they're like, okay, this thing is jacked up. Like he's not even using the language of racism. He's talking about the language of like immediacy, in that it's like it's pro-slavery. It supports and state sponsors this whole like thing, and so, um, but there's this. So we have the period where they're like friends are on a tour together. Do you find or did you come across the information about how Frederick Douglass came to find out about him?
I had learned about it in that class I took, but I honestly can't remember. Like I know that like it's a weird random story, like but like happenstance. He like
Yeah.
kind of crosses paths with them, but I don't remember the specifics.
So so when Douglas makes his way to like New Bedford, he works there as a laborer. It's a free man now. He's an escaped and
Works in
liberated
like a
man.
shipyard, right?
Yeah, he's working as a laborer in a shipyard.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
And somebody gives him a subscription to the Liberator because
Yes.
it's a present and a gift. And like if you look, there's nods to it as like in like it's referenced by Douglas a bunch of times. He's like, that's when the quote is like, I became in contact with the mind of Mr. Garrison, and his place or his papers took place in my heart only second to the Bible. So he has like this like immediate and electric like enthusiasm with the stuff that he was like coming across. And he had that moment where he said, I recognize that like I escaped from the system of slavery, and I like looked back at it and I was like, I cannot foresee a constitution that is not a pro-slavery model. And he's like, I can't disconnect my thoughts from that of Garrison's thoughts, because Garrison's calling for disunion, like the what's the term, disunionization. Yeah, he's trying to like disband the connection between he's calling for secession. He's talking about the North ceding from the South, right? And we have that like model where it's like always the South is leaving because they're,
which is exactly right. It's so backwards to like our normal idea of like, oh, you say the word secession and you think the South like immediately, but you have Garrison over here who's this like radical in the 1830s, and he's just like calling for all this crazy stuff that nobody equates with the North. Like it's just so foreign, and to see that like that separate side. And it's interesting too, because when you think about it, like when I was going through school, Garrison wasn't the main figure that we talked about. Like, and you see these guys like Garrison, John Brown, all these radical white like resistors, right? Like that they kind of get left out of the history books, especially on the national stage.
Totally. Well, we talk about it in like they're left out, and then we see what parts are brought into it and stuff, and you bring in like we have the revolutions or the slave rebellions and stuff. Those are the ones that make it into the books, right? Those are the ones that are like that sit on the kind of on like the precipice of the history that we teach, right, or that we are engaged in. It's like those that were radical but significant maybe died in like horrible ways, or they were part of what is it, Harper's Ferry?
That's Harper's Ferry raid.
Right. So it's interesting how we like pick and choose that, and it's really also kind of parallel in intrigue that you have a guy like William Lloyd Garrison who's connected to or pointed to as kind of the combustion or the catalyst to a lot of these more violent upbringings and stuff. The Nat Turner slave rebellion is like, they're like, yo, here's the thing. You have the Liberators being published and circulated around this time. It's got to be on you, my guy.
You got to make an example of somebody, right? Like
right.
It's totally like, okay, if we can't capture Garrison, regardless of the bounties that we've put on his head, like, but there's a slave uprising at the same time, which is literally just people like crying out for their human rights to be acknowledged, right? It's like, it's just like, oh, that was what they were able to kind of smack down and make an example out of. It's just wild. Like, it's just crazy to see that it's just simply like calling for human rights to be acknowledged.
Right. That's like that's another big part of it. What
Right.
did Garrison stand for? Like, dude was a pretty, pretty aggressive temperance guy, but he also connected that to women's rights. He also connected that to the abolition of slavery. He also connected that to like the reconceptualization of like Northern guilt also, right? He's got all these things that are going on. The temperance part comes from, or there's like at least a couple a couple people that have deep dived on his family that have talked about how his dad was reportedly, a horrible alcoholic, and that's why he abandoned the family. But then beyond that, he had a brother that died of alcoholism. He had so his foundation on those things is really interesting. Isn't formed necessarily through his religion, even though he's like, okay, I gotta, one of his things is like we have to go through and purge the sins of all my countrymen. He also says this thing like, my, what did he say? He said, our country is the world and my countrymen mankind. That's what he says, something like that. And so he was like looking at America as like that project to, okay, we are in a rough spot, and temperance would probably help because we don't need to be drunkards. Women's rights would probably help because we probably need that representation. The abolition of slavery would help because we have to see these people as human beings.
And it's such an early part in American history, right? Like if you really think about it and contextualize this time period on the whole timeline of America being like a nation, we're like 50 years in, right? So you're like, and I was talking about this in class the other day, like, and you could almost argue that the United States as we kind of know it doesn't really start existing until 1800, 1810-ish, because you're still figuring out all these nuts and bolts things, right? Like the Constitution gets ratified in like 1789. You have the Supreme Court and the Congress being created around the same time. And then for the first like 10 years, Washington's figuring out how to transition power. The Supreme Court is figuring out like, oh my God, I have a final say. Like the Supreme Court's like figuring out all of their power. And like, so the first 10, 12 years are really just this like, what's our boundaries? It's like, how are we going to set this up? So by the time you hit 1830, right, the country's really only about 30 years old. And they're trying to figure all this stuff out, and it's just a mess.
Well, and then you compound that equally by the fact that like we're still in an expansion phase, right? So like you're grappling with issues that are happening in New England that are trickling down and propagating through the South, and now the emerging Midwest as it's like starting to push that way. But like we're not even halfway across the physical globe or the physical kind of manifestation of the entire nation yet. So you also are like, our focus is also colonial at that point, and that continues from the moment that things are solidified and the Constitution's all established or established in its like nascent form, and that continues up and through and after World War II. So it's like,
I mean, we're still a colonial power.
Right.
Right. And I mean, it really, like we were talking about this last week, I think, with the Monroe Doctrine, right? Mm-hmm. The Monroe Doctrine is 7 years before this. And you have this whole idea that we can take advantage of this disaster in Europe. Like Europe has no structure politically that is like maintaining order in Europe. So these countries can't leave Europe because then they're leaving their own nation vulnerable. And so Monroe's like, hey, fine, you guys stay over there, we'll stay over here. And he's like essentially greenlighting colonization of the American continent. Like, nobody's going to stop us. So here we go. And then it's like we're putting the cart before the horse because we're not even solidified in our national ideals at that time. Like we're still fractured within our established nation, let alone this like trying to throw out people who are on the land that we're trying to claim and change their ideas to match like half of our nation, but not quite half of our nation. It's just a mess. Like, where are we coming from here?
Well, what's going well, and it's hard to say.
Right. Like what's effective and who's it effective for?
Right. Well, and then you won't have an answer to that. Well, then that answer to that creates problems that don't actually reach their fruition until the 1860s, right? And so like
Yeah.
you have these, which it seems to be the case for a lot of the period from founding to, I'm gonna say now still, right? We have these issues of like temperamental or like little small wins along the way, but then ultimately like mostly a large system of loss that's intertangled with that or interchanged with that. But yeah,
It just
dang,
seems like we always regress towards the mean, right? Like
right,
we'll make some progress and then we'll fall right back in. It's one step forward, two steps back, always. Like look at our biggest progressive movements, right? Like you have the victory of the Civil War to get rid of slavery and to keep the Union together, followed by this massive Jim Crow era that's like one of the like probably second to slavery, another huge egregious violation of human rights.
sure,
And then at the end of that time period, you have the progressive movement, which is like, oh, it's fantastic. We make all these great, strides against big business for the individuals. We're working towards a more inclusive representational system. And then we fall apart with the Great Depression. And so you're like, it's just we're making progress. And then it's like, nope, there it goes.
right. Well, and maybe a more like a more nuanced view of it would be to say that you look at these like really landmark moments, and there are certainly like there's a national, as a nation we have our interests are met, whether it's like interfering with foreign whatever or interloping into like new places to become part of what I'm gonna say it like the American empire because we act like it, right? If the British Empire is kind of lauded, like we definitely had the aspirations, we just were perhaps timed a little poorly. Um, but
Right.
but then you look at the populists that lead up to the Great Depression and stuff, and it's like there's some big winners, there was some like big trust busting. It was selective though. There was like, and then you're still only looking at a winning population of proportions of the country, right? Because leading up to the World War I was not a particularly a time that was particularly lauded for civil liberties at home on the home front, or
Yeah.
like making
No.
big strides towards like a little bit more like racial equity and equality, but also like gender equity and equality. Like those are just like you look at Woodrow Wilson and stuff, and the kind of conversation that he has, right? Those are not
Well, what's
not
the
like,
movie that he shows? He screens the KKK movie, Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation, yeah.
Birth of a Nation, like screened at the White House, and everybody's like we're like, what is going on?
Right.
But it also goes back to that idea, right? Of like, there's always we get presented in history class of like great compromises, right? Like you have the 3/5 compromise. Well, it's not really a compromise when the South runs out of there like celebrating this massive political victory. Right? Like, what did the North really gain? That they have a solid union that's founded on slavery and like not necessarily an equal distribution of power. And then you have the same thing with the compromise of like 1850, with these slave states and free states. And it's not, it doesn't really work out to be a beneficial compromise. It just prevents more warfare and more fracturing that turns into violence. But this compromise, it's like, yeah, well, everybody else is okay, right? And it's like 70% of the population doesn't have the right to vote.
Right. I mean,
what?
It depends. Yeah, right. Then it all goes like, what do you mean things are okay? And it's like that kind of radically engendered response, or the right place, right time scenario. Yeah, then we're totally kind of reaping the benefits of it. And it's really interesting because we look at like as students get from the history or the beginning of the signing or the signing of the Declaration of Independence, like the building of the Constitution and stuff, and then you get that 30-year window where we've kind of said, okay, this was legit U.S. here up to up to Lloyd Garrison's time and stuff, and the sentiment of the people that were becoming the abolitionists at that time was that we have this like northern fantasy built into us. I think it's probably, and I imagine this is being from, like, for me, it's like probably being from California, growing up with like histories of California, taught in California, taught in a relatively, like, not even relatively, like a pretty big bastion of like uh, retelling the war stories of the North, right? We look at it like you're always taught as a child the North was the not, they don't say this explicitly, right? The North is the good team and then the South is the bad side. But like that's how all the movies paint it. I don't know if you ever like
it's implied the whole way throughout, right? Like there's nobody's coming out of the Civil War, like learning about the Civil War going, the South had some good things going for them. Like, there's just no avenue for anybody to be left to go, the South doesn't sound like a terrible place. Right. And it's like, it is that whole idea of history is written by the victors, which means that you're looking through this different lens. And it's also like this responsibility, I think, of people to be like, we can't even allow a little bit of validation to this system that allowed slavery to flourish and just this gross violation of human rights.
Right.
But it also leads into what you were talking about with the temperance movement and the women's movement and everything, and how it's interesting how the abolition movement is tied to the women's movement at first, right? Like you have Seneca Falls in 1848 and Douglas was like there, right? And so you have a very close connection between the two, yet women don't get the right to vote for another 70 years. And so it's like, at what point was like, how does the discussion come about? Or is it just like, hey, we need to expand the electorate somehow, and so like, are we just willing to cast women aside, be like, well, better luck next time, and we're getting the right to vote, so we'll vote in your interest.
Right. And I mean, we read, the students read what to a Slave is the 4th of July by Frederick Douglass, and it echoes that sentiment, right? It's like, I'm standing in front of you now, and we're in the North, and there are many of you that are like-minded, that are, that don't have equivalent experience as perhaps me, and don't maybe engender the or embody the politics that I need you to deliver on. But I'm telling you right here, right now, you should take this day of celebration, contextualize it within who I stand for. He talks about, he's like the unnumbered thousands that I stand in place of, right? And so it's like, you look at that moment, and he's reach out and saying the same thing. He's like, yo, you guys, like, there's a huge issue here. You have he kind of leans on it, like, you have the voting power essentially to actualize this thing, which is crazy, right? Because if we, I think, was it 1840, what year is the 4th of July? I think it's 1840 something.
Yeah, it's relatively, I thought it was maybe early 50s, but I think it's like 48, maybe 49, somewhere in like 47 to 53 range, I think.
Yeah, you're right. So it's right at the beginning of the 50s. So it's like 52, right?
Okay,
so, So you're spot on. So he's saying this like still in pursuit of what's going to be in pursuit of the Civil War, but there's the conversations that he's had with Garrison would have been like, 12 years before this, or 10 years before this, to some extent. And Frederick Douglass is, and then we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but Frederick Douglass has this like he has a total departure from Garrisonian ideals to an extent. Garrison's entire thing was that the Constitution is so jacked up, that the Union is so like almost like corrupted by it, that the empowering people to vote isn't the answer. That was his whole thing. He's like, it's not, the power of voting is not the thing that's going to change it. He's like, it's going to be the secession and the building of a new union, because like to vote, one of the things that was coming out in the Liberators that it's attaching to vote is to participate in the like foundationally pro-slavery union that the Constitution promotes. So it's
like an arbitrary broken system.
Right.
Like it's completely, and Hamilton, even like if you look at the Federalist Papers, right? Like if you look at the early writings, these guys even admit it. They're like, does it meet the perfect ideal? No. But yeah, I don't think we have the time or really the energy to be able to fix it perfectly. So this is good enough. Let's just get started. And like, I think that gets lost because these guys don't picture this Constitution and their initial founding government to be the infinite ruling, like, be all end all, right? Like they envision it to adapt. Like there's no way that, like, they even say like, oh, there's like, this is not perfect, but this is what we need to move forward. And so it's kind of that interesting side of the originalist, like going back to the Supreme Court justice discussion, right? The originalists or the constitutionalists, it's like, yeah, but they didn't even expect it to be the like exact written law forever.
Right. Yeah. That's I always grew up like I remember taking my middle school when I was growing up had honors history for 8th grade. So you could take honors AP or not AP honors U.S. history in 8th grade because with the 8th grade curriculum is U.S. history. I don't know if it's changed since then, but what I do remember is our professor or our teacher being like so innately tied to this statement that the United States Declaration or the United States Constitution is the longest standing, or maybe like right now it's the oldest standing like form of government in the world because you have Magna Carta is not a written document, right? So if you're looking at the two, he's like, if you look at the details, we're right there. It's the one that's the oldest that's still around today. And I was like, that doesn't mean that's not. I remember then being like, is that good? And I like look at it now, and I'm like, I don't think that's something that we laud, and we should like point to and be like, whoa, it's the oldest thing that's out there. And I think about this in terms of cars. When I go outside, I'm like, I don't just like love the oldest car that's on the streets, like the oldest the oldest like beater on the street. I'm not like, dang, I gotta see myself in that. And
well, it's interesting, like thinking about that old part of it, right? And like I was looking through Twitter the other day, and I was getting some political takes from some people on there, and somebody said that, it's interesting to hear this originalist argument for Supreme Court justices, because if that's the case, where like the originalist idea of like what's written is written and that's set in stone, judicial review isn't even written in there. So are you telling me that they don't believe that their power is justified? Like that's such a contradictory like ideal to hold if you say that what's written in the Constitution is law. Well, you interpret it like your power is from interpreted stuff that's implied. Like it's not even directly stated. So it's interesting to hear how people manipulate it to fit their needs.
Totally. And that's like the fallacy perhaps of the term checks and balances, I think, within our system. We've come to understand that the like modern US democracy is like not one where the checks and balances are operating as like intended. We now have such like partisan politics. Right now, it's just like vitriol is everywhere, right? It's every single, no matter what facet it is. You're looking at like presidencies that are like, I look at them as like being, potentially 8 years long with like 2 productive years. Because you have that like stifling that happens. You have that initial excitement, and you saw the same thing I think in the Obama administration. And you have those first 2 years where you get things like the Affordable Care Act that come to fruition, or in its like most basic stages, hit the center fold, and then you lose the primaries because you sacrifice like a bunch of like Senate seats, and then you lose like the stability in those systems of government. And it's not even like it's not on idealism. It's not on idealism. No, if it was on idealism, the split would not be like, red votes one way, blue votes the other way. And that comes, I mean, the confirmation of, Barrett the other day, there was like promises by Republican senators that there was no way that they were going to pass forward, or they would vote in confidence of a confirmation of a Supreme Court justice in the final days of, or potentially a final.
He said within the year. I mean, like, weeks. Like,
so you have like, if you look at Garland's, right, like, or hit the kind of stopping of his appointment, but but you have like those assurances that were placed in like good faith assurances that we're going to, like, when push comes to shove, like we're going to be on the side of like this is kind of jacked up and we can't like undo, or we can't, like, we've already said, 4 years prior that we're not going to do this, so there's no way that we can do this now, and then immediately like vote in favor of confirmation, because what it came down to when push came to shove, it was like, okay, like I out in my altruism, I would vote against the confirmation, but we're going to lose already. And that vote is going to lose already, and so now I save face, and that part is like backed up. So you lose like the balance of those systems in terms of like, or maybe not the balance, right? Because they still have checks on other things, but you lose like their authenticity.
Well, you absolutely do, because like I was listening to somebody the other day talking about how they were interviewing like undecided voters, which is like a rare breed in 2020, right? Like, what's the percentage of undecided voters out there? It's got to be small. And so, but they were talking to somebody and they were like, the most important thing to me is that there's a pro-life justice on the Supreme Court. And so their whole thing, like their whole vote for 2020 came down to, if Barrett got appointed, then he was going to vote for Biden because he got his pro-life justice. But if Barrett wasn't appointed and they didn't have a vote, they were going to vote for Trump because they knew that Trump would appoint a pro-life justice. And so it's like, how does that one small decision, right? Like, and obviously, like, to some people, it's not a small decision,
sure,
right? Like, obviously, like, it depends on who you are and what, whatever else, where those issues lie. But regardless, like, how does one issue like that dictate your entire presidential voting? And then beyond that, are you saying that, because you got to assume that somebody who's doing that is probably going down ticket voting, right? Like, I would assume that if they're voting like that, then maybe it's down ticket voting. And so, like, what's the impact of that? Just having that one singular issue. And then to go back to the 1800s, how many people were like, slavery's bad, but man, this economy, I got to keep it going. Like, it just didn't break the threshold for importance in their, in their voting. It's crazy how that one issue can just skew everything.
Well, and then now you look at like like how the Supreme Court is set up, and the real secret in that whole sentiment is that like the Supreme Court nomination is infinitely more important than the presidency, because it's going to be infinitely more impactful in terms of the reach or the amount of time. Like, an appointment of Barrett is going to last 20, potentially 30, 40 years, right? And the appointment of a president.
Do you know how old she is?
She's like, I think she's pretty
48,
early 40s. Yeah, 40s. Yeah, let's see.
I think she's like 40, like early mid 40s, somewhere in there.
48.
48, right. Yeah. So it's like, I mean, she could effectively be on there for 30 years, no problem.
Right. And so that one's infinitely more impactful. So I can see the thought process. I can see that being the exact case. I don't know, and this would be reaching, like, I obviously don't get to reach those people and have that conversation, but I don't know that the weight of that decision really makes it, or maybe it does. Maybe that's exactly why they would vote that way. But like the action or the empowerment of a Supreme Court justice, or the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice, is so much more important than a presidency. I would think if I am the establishment Democrats, or the group of establishment Democrats, like, I would beg, borrow, and plead as much as possible for as long as possible to stop a confirmation like that. But because it, again, do I think that irreparable damage can be done in 4 years given a particularly tyrannical administration? We've seen that. And historically we've seen that. Well,
there's a lot of parallels to Jackson. People like to draw parallels to Jackson when they're talking about Trump because of the Supreme Court stuff. Right. I mean, that is a large portion of it, right? Because if you really go back and start examining Jackson's presidency, there's a lot of people out there who will kind of let Jackson off the hook for some of the bad things he's done, because they're like, well, every president before him wanted to do it. He just had the political climate to do it. It's
Right.
like that doesn't justify it, but that's one attempt. But the other thing, going back to the courts, is that he has Roger Taney, who delivers the majority opinion on Dred Scott, like one of the most influential court cases that leads up to that pre-Civil War. 1857 effectively rules that the United States is a slave nation, regardless if you're in a free state. You're still a slave, and you're going back to the South. And so, but Taney has no real experience before that. He was the Secretary of the Treasury in Jackson's first term, who defunds illegally the National Bank. And then, as like a reward, Jackson's like, hey, by the way, you're going to be on the Supreme Court now. And he's on the court from 1835 to 1865 or 64 or 5, right? So you're like, this guy's on there for 30 years, is nowhere near qualified, and absolutely carries on these Jacksonian ideals, which is that whole idea of legacy, right? Like when you're talking about how much irreparable damage can be done in 4 years, well, it depends on where that damage falls, right? Like an executive order, I was listening to Biden talk about his first 100 days would be just a lot of overturning executive orders, which means that like whatever Trump decided he wanted to sign into effect, or any president for that matter, could be outdone, just overturned with the stroke of a pen.
Right.
But a Supreme Court justice, to get rid of a Supreme Court justice, you need 67 votes in the Senate. Even if, and that's where people are like, that's why there's a discussion about packing the courts, right? Like that's why there's a discussion of, and not a discussion of, could you impeach a justice? And there's a whole nother issue with that if you really were trying to go down that rabbit hole. But the only way you can overturn this Republican or conservative majority would be to increase the number, which would dilute the power.
Right. Which, I mean, I always love this. I always love the idea that the stacking of the courts as being an intentional thing. Like, what do you mean? But yeah, like to go back to the Taney point, right? I remember we had talked last time about the kind of the response of this response of intellectuals and imperative intellectuals during that time, and we talked a lot about we'd mentioned in passing kind of the Frederick Douglass response to that. Right. So following, besides the fact that it's like labeled the cannot speech or the cannot response, he goes on to say this in particular about that exact thing. He says, the Supreme Court of the United States is not the only power in this world. It is very great, but the Supreme Court of the Almighty is greater. Judge Taney can do many things, but he cannot change the essence of things, making evil good and good evil. And he goes on to talk about like those who seek slavery in the Union and who are everlastingly dealing blows upon the Union in the belief that they are killing slavery are woefully mistaken. They're fighting a dead form inside of a living and powerful reality. It is clearly not because of a peculiar character of our Constitution that we have slavery, but the wicked pride, love of power, selfish perversiveness of the American people. Slavery lives in this country not because of any paper constitution, but in the moral blindness of the American people who persuade themselves that they are safe through the rights of others, or though the rights of others may be struck down. So it's like he has this exact. This conversation is not happening in 2020. This conversation is happening in 1857. This conversation's already been had. People have thought this, and it's just like, but nothing is. There's been no alteration to that thing or recognition that like there's like a hugely disproportionately there's a disproportional power that's placed in this like one branch of government. I think it's almost like inconceivable to look at like how powerful the Supreme Court is, how like powerful the modern executive position has been. Like the expansion of the executive branch over the last 4-5 presidencies has been insane. And you look at an Obama administration and stuff, and like I think he set the record for the most executive orders that was passed in like any 8-year period of any president ever. So it's like we're only doing that more now. And I think, if there's
But is that a result of this hyper-partisan culture, right? Like if you, because at what point is that foresight to a certain extent of the founders to be like, because they talk about factions, they talk about political parties and how it's the downfall of America is if we faction off and become these like two extremely polarized, that's the downfall of governance basically. And so is that executive order kind of like a fail-safe, right? Like not necessarily a check and balance, but like an actual fail-safe to be like, if we cannot effectively govern, life doesn't stop, right? Like people are still going through stuff, but if there's something so severe that, that we can't get on without solving, then it has to fall to somebody. And so who does that fall to? I guess the executive.
Right. Well,
they're supposed to represent the majority.
Well, and then the Supreme Court is idealistically supposed to be an unbiased, apolitical vestige of the American people. The judicial branch is not supposed to be like the pony to the executive.
Right.
But like I don't see like the Supreme Court right now is like pretty partisan. You could point to almost every single Supreme Court justice and say like how they're going to vote on an issue before the issue is discussed.
Except for Roberts lately, right? Like, right. I mean, Roberts, well, while RBG was still alive and voting, right? Like Roberts broke with that conservative group and to the point where he drew criticisms from Trump, right? Sure. So it's like, and that's just so funny for us to be like, a Republican appointed justice who just so happens to be the Chief Justice doesn't vote with the Republican president. Like what? And it's like, well, yeah, he's doing his job. Like, and we're just so dumbfounded by the fact that somebody could be, like remove themselves from the politics and focus on the law of it or the constitutionality of it.
Totally. And I mean, well, part of it too is that like one of the dangers now not danger, depends who you are, I suppose. One of the kind of realities that we face right now is that with Roberts playing that really like influential kind of that slide position, right? Mm-hmm. He's shifting his shifts the formation a lot. Right. That's gone now. Like, that just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right? Oh yeah. And you have like your hyper conservative or the voice of the hyper conservative, like Clarence Thomas. I think that like I would say that Kavanaugh is not going to break. He's been pretty staunchly like
he falls in line.
Right. And he's like a potato, so it doesn't matter. So but now that like delicate balance that's part of this immaculate American experiment. It's like no. And this is not the first time like we look at 1857, like this is not the first time that this like stuff has happened. We just have such a short like memory for it, or maybe it's
maybe we just don't want to remember it, I guess, like sweep it under the rug so we don't have to talk about it. But it's like a family discussion at Thanksgiving, right?
Right,
like,
sure.
Oh, we don't talk about that. No. But in that same speech with Douglas, he even equates that decision to David versus Goliath battle for against slavery, right? And so it's like it can really feel like some of these Supreme Court rulings are insurmountable. I mean, because in theory, they're supposed to be the last final word. Like you said, they're this apolitical, nonpartisan group that is supposed to be giving you this, interpretation. And for them to take the side that a majority of people don't necessarily agree with, it can feel like the government is stacking up against the public because of, the idea that a majority of people don't support the person who appointed these justices, which is like, and that's where I think the electoral upset of 2016 can somewhat be equated to the universal suffrage. Because if you really look at it, right, like Trump doesn't represent a majority of people. Like that's just fact. I mean, more people voted for Clinton than they did for Trump, which, you know, you could go back to this 1800s and say that there's no way that a majority of people, including like people of color, women, and all, you know, all men, would have supported these candidates. Like there's just no way. So I would think that the Supreme Court and these landmark decisions that really kind of like upset people, you know, are a product of a minority making rules for the majority.
Totally. No, you're exactly right. And it's much better. We're much, I mean, to some extent, we're much healthier of a system now than we were then, right? I think that's, in terms of representation, we're probably infinitely better off. But that's exactly right. You have the like 1830s to up through the Civil War, where it's like especially heinous in representation, or especially because, like, again, going back to our northern exceptionalist like vantage point and stuff, it's not even that like you had like you needed to have like just a majority of males in the North who would want to push abolition. That probably wouldn't. I don't even know that would have happened. I don't think we have enough evidence to say that would be like a clean sweep of it.
Yeah,
because abolition movements weren't especially like they weren't like overwhelmingly popular, right?
Right.
But then like the overwhelming idea, because of like the sheer number of people then that aren't represented in that vote that were anti-slavery, so on and so forth, like that maybe would in voicing those opinions or giving voice to those opinions or empowering those that would have been like the kind of icing on the cake type of thing. But instead it's time gated behind decades and decades of like kind of pitter patter.
And that's where, like, talking about representation, right? Like how you were saying that we're a lot better off. We are, but like at the same time, I think people forget about the connection between representation and the Electoral College. Right, like the Electoral College is the aggregate of the Congress, right? And so you're like, people don't realize, I think, or it kind of gets like secondary mention when we're talking about a census year, because that's the apportionment of congressional seats, which directly correlates to the Electoral College. So there's a lot of things that I've been hearing on Twitter and the some news outlets, when they're talking about like, if the Democrats win the trifecta, right? Like they get the presidency, the Senate, and the House, the first thing they need to do is expand the House by 100 members.
Right.
And I mean, it's just so reasonable, because when I was looking at this over the summer, we go through a lot of expansions in the House. It's not uncommon. It's not against the Constitution. It's not like saying that, just because we've had this number, that's it. Like, it's just an arbitrary kind of thing. It's an arbitrary way to figure out like which method are we going to use. And there's so many methods of apportionment. It's gross. Like, people are arguing about, does the decimal point count? If it doesn't count, like, if you have 1.3 is your representation and somebody else has 7.4, who gets that extra seat? And so it just right. And so it's like, it's crazy the methods of apportionment and how that plays a part. But beyond that, right, it's like, you have to just absolutely look at it as a way of, the last expansion was like 1930, right? Like, and to say that that the nation hasn't grown exponentially since the early to mid 1900s is just like, how? And then we wonder why our politics are carried out in this like nuclear 1950s, ideals. Well, it's because our representation is rooted in that.
Totally. I think we started our conversation last time on this. We were kind of like, I think it was us. We were laughing about how like those weird truths about American, or democracy, or the American like landscape as we imagine it today, are like pointed out by like really, in the minutia, right? Like, Hawaii was not a state during World War II. This wasn't a state during World War II. Wouldn't be for over a decade, like at the end of it, right? And so, you think of, I think we had mentioned this, like the flag at Iwo Jima, right, has 48
Yeah,
stars on it. It's like you have all of
right.
these ideas that like just they don't hold true, because like the representative democracy that you're talking about, or you're preserving and stuff, it hasn't existed in its current form. It didn't exist in its current form. And I think
Which is just wild, right? Like that's
it
just
just is.
crazy.
Right.
Like for somebody in our generation or our students' generations to sit there and be like, because World War II is just absolutely overcovered in my opinion. Like, don't get me wrong, it needs to be covered and it's deep in depth. But I mean, when I was in high school, we spent like 5 weeks on World War II, like over a month, really. And so it's just like, something that we hold in such high esteem, right? Like, think about the amount of video games and the amount of like honor that's attached to Omaha Beach and Normandy and just the World War II in general, like Iwo Jima and all of those, right? But for us to not realize or have this just disconnect that there were 48 states fighting in World War II, right? Like, like it's just what a failure of our educational system to a certain extent, right? Like, for us to not have that pointed out to us that like, oh yeah, by the way, Alaska and Hawaii, they weren't with us.
Right.
Like what do you mean?
Or the attack that like was that spurred us into the war was like on, and maybe this holds true. Maybe this would be the case if the attack on Pearl Harbor was in Guam. Maybe we would have had the same response. I tend not to think so. Perhaps because we can, and I maybe associate that with like the treatment that other territories like Puerto Rico receive at our behest, right? Like we can't even send, or we're almost unwilling to send aid during hurricane season to Puerto Rico. So like the esteem that we hold those places, but Hawaii for some reason became that like a bastion for defending
it's a strategy thing, right? Like
sure.
To a certain extent, we look at this. It's kind of like Japan is expanding massively in the Pacific, right. And that's our line in the sand. That's our arbitrary like do not cross, and because that's where our Pacific Fleet is, and that's where it's like it matters, and it's kind of crazy now because I mean like obviously just saying the 48 stars, right? Like it made sense, but I didn't really put that together with the fact that Hawaii, when it was attacked, wasn't a state. Like, I mean, I knew that obviously from just saying it, but you're right. Like, what do you mean? Like, we're getting mad over this colonial expansion into our colonies?
Right. Something that was taken without a willing participant, another like a toppled monarchy, like
right.
I think it's really like the way that like Hawaii has been militarized is like its own like I could spend like 5 days talking about that in itself, right. but the idea of like the end of empires that is going to come as a result of World War II, kind of, right?
Right.
But like the end of but it's also preservation of this thing that we've decided is still our property, and then like we're gonna defend our interests in this regard. So I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there. I think the most important like sentiment to come out of like all of that and all of this discussion is that like we are missing the stories that are foundational and like representative people whose interests weren't represented during that time. We look at we look at William Lloyd Garrison as an influential white dude who stands in or gives voice to women, or gives voice to a right. really like that's a huge one. I don't know why we always like kind of like gloss over that. We're like we really no, we can't gloss over that. It's like that's a huge deal, and like and also like the innumerable people that are like still in 1930 or 1830 facing like the consequences of the slave system that's set up. And so like I think any chance that we can give to tell that story and like perpetuate those stories, and we talk about invisible histories like all the time. Like we could take a couple days out of World War II because like it turns out that these foundational moments were really, really important as well.
Right. Well, it's like that whole idea of how many battles do I have to memorize in order to push out these these representational stories that are completing the picture, right? Like
Right.
by zooming so close into World War II, we lose sight of this whole massive, grand scheme picture of America. Like by focusing more on the battles and this empire stuff, right? We lose out on the narratives of the Navajo code talkers,
Okay.
right? Like the ability for us, like how wild is this, right? Like the one of the major assets we have in World War II that allows us to be successful is through the help of a group of people who have just been absolutely disrespected and oppressed from the beginning. But they sit there and they come to our aid to the point where they're instrumental in winning the war. And we're just like, oh yeah, by the way, there are these Navajos that talk in code and they help us.
Right.
While we're fighting for the land that we stole from them.
Right.
Right. It's just crazy.
Yeah. Dang. I totally agree. And I think that would probably be the main sentiment of, besides us just like talking, because I could talk politics all day and stuff, but I think that that's kind of been in the lead up to making one of these or to recording one of these, that's kind of that's going to continue to be like our important thing. So
right.
Well, maybe because we've been going for almost an hour now, so
maybe
we'll stop this one up and then I'll look through it and we'll see what we got and we'll kind of launch in on another topic next time we come back. Sound good?
No, I think it's perfect. Yeah, I think it's great just for us to have that conversation. Like there's so much